Beloved, consistency is the bridge between revelation and manifestation. You can't conquer what you're not committed to confront in prayer. There is a realm that only opens to the consistent, not the casual, not the convenient, but the committed intercessor. Prayer is not an event, it's a lifestyle, a divine rhythm that keeps heaven and earth in sync. You see, the enemy doesn't fear a praying person, he fears a consistent praying person because consistency builds authority. Every time you pray, you're not repeating words, you're reinforcing your dominion. Every moment in prayer is a spiritual investment, depositing power, wisdom, and favor into your heavenly account. The truth is, inconsistency breaks momentum, but consistency births miracles. When you keep showing up before God, even when you don't feel Him, even when you don't see results, heaven keeps score. You're building a history with God that hell can't erase. So today, I came to awaken the prayer warrior within you, to stir the fire of persistence, to call forth the discipline of consistency, because when prayer becomes your pattern, breakthrough becomes your lifestyle. This is the hour to press in. This is the season to be steadfast, because power doesn't visit, it dwells where consistency lives. Consistency in prayer establishes divine alignment with heaven's agenda, because prayer is not merely communication, it is synchronization with the divine will of God. When a believer learns to dwell consistently in the secret place, something supernatural begins to happen. The heart of man starts to beat in rhythm with the heartbeat of heaven. Prayer becomes less about asking and more about aligning, less about telling God what to do and more about hearing what He already intends to do through you. Consistency forms the pathway through which divine instructions flow, uninterrupted, creating a continual download of revelation, wisdom, and strategies directly from the throne room. The moment you make prayer a consistent discipline rather than a reactionary act, you move from being a spiritual survivor to a spiritual commander, orchestrating heaven's agenda upon the earth through divine partnership. Inconsistency creates spiritual interference, but consistency opens clear channels of divine transmission. Just as a radio must stay tuned to the right frequency to receive a broadcast, the believer must stay spiritually attuned through consistent prayer to receive heaven's direction. Every time you pray, you are tuning your spirit, fine-adjusting your discernment, and clearing away static from the noise of the world. When you choose consistency, your spirit becomes a conduit of divine power rather than a container of occasional inspiration. Heaven recognizes consistent voices because consistency signals commitment, and commitment invites trust. God entrusts secrets, assignments, and authority to those who prove faithful in prayer, because faithfulness in the unseen determines fruitfulness in the seen. When you rise daily to meet God, whether in silence, worship, or travail, you are writing a spiritual pattern that heaven honors. Angels respond to rhythm. Divine timing responds to consistency. There is a cadence in heaven's kingdom that is activated when you pray persistently, and that rhythm aligns your earthly reality with heavenly order. Consistent prayer uproots chaos, dismantles confusion, and ushers in divine clarity. It repositions you from reaction to dominion. The more consistent your prayer life, the more your atmosphere begins to reflect heaven's atmosphere. Peace replaces panic, order replaces disorder, and divine alignment takes precedence over human striving. A consistent prayer life teaches your soul submission and your spirit sensitivity. It breaks the flesh's rebellion and establishes the rule of the spirit. When you make prayer a daily practice, not a periodic emergency, you allow the Holy Spirit to refine your motives and purify your desires until they mirror the desires of God. Consistency sanctifies your will. You begin to want what God wants, to love what He loves, and to resist what He resists. Through daily alignment, you are transformed into an instrument of divine intention, a vessel through which heaven's government can operate unhindered on earth. This alignment is what empowers the believer to decree a thing and see it established, to intercede with accuracy rather than assumption. Consistency is also the foundation for sustained power. Sporadic prayer produces emotional relief, but consistent prayer produces spiritual authority. Authority comes through relationship, and relationship deepens through consistency. Every encounter in prayer is a layer of intimacy added to your covenant with God. Over time, consistency builds confidence, and confidence unlocks boldness. You no longer approach God as a stranger, but as a son or daughter who knows their access, understands their inheritance, and exercises their dominion with precision. The enemy's greatest strategy is distraction, because he knows if he can interrupt your consistency, he can dilute your power. But the one who remains steadfast in prayer remains unshaken in battle. Every mighty move of God in Scripture was preceded by consistent prayer. Elijah prayed until the heavens opened. Daniel prayed 3 times a day, even when it was outlawed. Jesus himself rose early to commune with the Father, not out of duty but alignment. He modeled the rhythm of divine synchronization, showing that sustained authority flows from sustained communion. When consistency becomes your spiritual discipline, you no longer pray only for events, you pray to sustain environments. You carry an atmosphere of prayer that shifts rooms, transforms meetings, and births revival wherever you go. You become the evidence of heaven's alignment in human form. Consistency also sharpens discernment. When you maintain a steady posture of prayer, you become sensitive to the whispers of the Spirit. You begin to discern times, seasons, and divine movements with clarity. You know when to advance, when to wait, when to speak, and when to be silent. Heaven's agenda becomes your instinct. The reason many believers miss divine opportunities is not because God is silent, but because their prayer life is sporadic, leaving them spiritually disoriented. Consistency keeps you calibrated. It keeps your spiritual compass fixed on true north, preventing detours caused by emotional storms or external pressures. A consistent prayer life sustains inner peace and divine stability in seasons of turbulence. Prayer aligns not only your spirit but also your emotions, your thoughts, and your decisions. When you meet God daily, He regulates your spiritual atmosphere before the day begins. You don't respond to life's chaos from a place of panic, but from a place of peace. Consistency becomes your anchor when circumstances try to drift you away from faith. Every moment spent consistently before God builds resilience, a spiritual backbone that keeps you standing when others fall. You learn to operate from divine rest rather than human restlessness. When you are consistent in prayer, you begin to move prophetically, not reactively. You sense what is coming before it manifests, because your spirit is aligned with heaven's timeline. Consistency gives you foresight, strategy, and divine perspective. It removes fear because you operate from revelation rather than speculation. You become a spiritual architect, shaping realities through decrees birthed in prayer. Alignment with heaven ensures that every word you speak carries weight because your voice echoes His will. The consistent believer becomes a mouthpiece of divine order, releasing heaven's blueprint into the earth realm. Consistency in prayer also builds spiritual momentum. Each prayer builds upon the last, creating cumulative energy in the spirit that eventually manifests as breakthrough in the natural. Many give up before they see results because they underestimate the compounding power of consistent intercession. Every prayer is a brick in a spiritual structure. Every moment of communion strengthens the foundation. Consistency ensures there are no gaps in the wall, no breaches for the enemy to exploit. It is the mortar that holds your faith firm and your vision intact. Through consistency, what begins as discipline transforms into delight, and what once required effort becomes effortless flow, because your spirit has fully aligned with heaven's rhythm. Persistent prayer fortifies spiritual authority and dismantles demonic resistance, because persistence is the evidence of faith that refuses to yield to delay or opposition. The realm of the Spirit recognizes persistence as power in motion, a force that presses through barriers until divine intervention manifests. Every time you pray persistently, you reaffirm your spiritual dominion over circumstances, over principalities, and over every unseen resistance. Persistence transforms prayer from a mere petition into a weapon of war, a decree of victory that reverberates through the heavens. It is the sound of a believer who refuses to retreat, until the will of God is fully established on earth as it is in heaven. Persistent prayer doesn't beg for results. It enforces divine outcome. It is the posture of a spiritual warrior who knows that authority is not proven in moments of ease, but in the endurance of consistent warfare. Demonic resistance thrives where spiritual authority is absent, but persistence in prayer erodes the enemy's stronghold. The adversary's strategy is to exhaust your endurance, to make you believe that silence from heaven means defeat, but persistence proves that your faith is unbreakable. Every time you return to the altar, even after discouragement, heaven witnesses your tenacity, and hell trembles at your resilience. Persistent prayer builds endurance in your spirit, forging the capacity to sustain victory when it comes. The breakthrough that persistence produces is not just situational, it is transformational. It changes who you are, strengthening your spirit to operate at a higher dimension of faith and authority. When you persist in prayer, you are not repeating empty words. You are reasserting dominion over atmosphere. You are declaring that delay does not mean denial, and that resistance is only the backdrop for revelation. Persistence transforms waiting into warfare and silence into strategy. The persistent intercessor understands that sometimes the battle is not to change the circumstance, but to refine the vessel through which God's power will flow. Every prolonged season of prayer produces greater weight in the spirit, because spiritual authority is measured not by words but by consistency under pressure. The longer you persist, the more heaven invests in your assignment, because persistence proves readiness. Persistent prayer dismantles demonic operations by disrupting their continuity. Hell functions through patterns, cycles of fear, oppression, and confusion, but persistence in prayer interrupts those patterns. When you keep praying, you keep breaking cycles. You frustrate the timing of demonic agendas, delaying and disarming them until they lose their power. Persistence is the weapon that wears down the adversary. Just as erosion shapes mountains through the steady force of water, persistent prayer shapes spiritual landscapes through the steady force of faith. Every declaration weakens demonic influence. Every hour of intercession builds a wall of resistance around your purpose, your family, and your destiny. Persistence is heaven's strategy for those who refuse to surrender territory back to the enemy. Authority is not granted to the inconsistent. It is forged through persistence in hidden places. When you persist in prayer, your spirit begins to command in realms your voice has never entered before. Heaven starts to recognize your sound. Angels are dispatched at the frequency of your faith. Persistence establishes a spiritual identity that the enemy cannot ignore, because your voice becomes a registered sound in the spirit, one that carries weight and authority. Demons recognize consistent voices because they speak from a place of established dominion. Persistence marks you as one who cannot be intimidated, one who prays not from emotion, but from revelation. You understand that prayer is not about feeling powerful, but about standing in the authority already given to you through Christ. Persistent prayer is not noise. It is negotiation. It is the act of standing between heaven and earth, refusing to move until divine order is restored. This kind of prayer shifts atmospheres, dismantles demonic decrees, and births the supernatural in the natural realm. The persistent believer prays through resistance, knowing that spiritual battles are not won by a single cry but by a sustained command. Just as Elijah prayed repeatedly for rain until the cloud appeared, persistence ensures that your words do not return void. Heaven honors endurance, because endurance mirrors God's nature. The same God who never ceases to uphold the universe empowers the believer, who never ceases to pray. Persistence is the reflection of divine stability in human form. Persistent prayer also redefines your perception of time. You stop measuring delay as denial and start perceiving it as divine development. God uses persistence to enlarge your spiritual capacity so that when the answer comes, you have the strength to sustain it. Many receive promises prematurely and lose them because they lack the persistence required to carry the weight of manifestation. Persistent prayer fortifies your spirit, disciplines your emotions, and anchors your faith until the blessing arrives in fullness. The delay becomes your training ground, not your graveyard. Each moment of persistence deepens your roots, ensuring that when the winds of adversity blow, your faith remains immovable. Demonic resistance cannot prevail against a praying believer who refuses to relent. Every attack loses momentum when met with persistence. The more the enemy presses, the stronger your resolve becomes. And the stronger your resolve, the weaker his influence. Persistence in prayer changes the battleground dynamic. It forces the enemy into retreat while drawing divine reinforcement into your situation. You become unshakable because your authority is fortified through endurance. Persistent prayer trains you to rule in the midst of resistance, to decree rather than despair, to command rather than complain. Your persistence becomes a prophetic act that proclaims, I will not move until heaven moves through me. Persistence in prayer also purifies your motive. As you continue to seek God beyond immediate results, selfish desires are stripped away, and what remains is pure intention, aligned with God's will. Persistence matures your prayers. You begin to pray from revelation rather than reaction. What once was a cry for relief becomes a decree of transformation. You shift from asking God to change things for you to allowing Him to change things through you. In that process, your authority deepens because now you pray as a co-laborer, not a bystander. The enemy loses his leverage when your persistence is rooted in divine purpose rather than personal gain. The persistent believer carries a spiritual force that cannot be easily silenced. When persistence meets resistance, resistance must bow. The atmosphere begins to yield under the pressure of sustained intercession. Heaven begins to respond not because of repetition, but because of endurance born of faith. Persistent prayer builds an altar of continual fire, and fire attracts divine presence. Where there is persistent prayer, there is consistent power. The Spirit of God hovers over persistent altars, manifesting glory, deliverance, and revelation in increasing measure. Persistence invites divine habitation, and habitation produces transformation. Every time you persist, you are reaffirming your dominion, declaring that no weapon formed against you shall prosper, and reminding the forces of darkness that your authority is not seasonal but eternal. A consistent prayer life transforms moments of devotion into a lifestyle of dominion because prayer was never meant to be confined to isolated encounters, but designed to become the atmosphere in which a believer lives, moves, and operates. When prayer becomes a lifestyle, it transcends ritual and evolves into rhythm, an unbroken flow of communion with God that shapes every thought, every decision, and every response. The consistent believer does not visit the presence of God, they abide in it. Through daily communion, the believer begins to think God's thoughts, speak God's words, and act in God's authority. Dominion is no longer an external pursuit but an internal posture cultivated through consistency in prayer. Prayer ceases to be an event and becomes an environment, transforming ordinary moments into divine opportunities for manifestation. When prayer becomes your way of life, every breath becomes an act of worship, and every step becomes an extension of divine purpose. You carry the presence of God into your workplace, your conversations, your challenges, and your victories. You stop compartmentalizing the sacred and the secular, because your life itself becomes the altar where heaven and earth meet. A lifestyle of prayer trains you to walk in unbroken fellowship with the Spirit, to hear His whisper in the noise, and to sense His guidance in the mundane. Dominion flows naturally from that awareness, because you are never out of alignment. The authority you carry is no longer activated only in prayer closets, but demonstrated in daily life through decisions made in divine wisdom and words spoken with spiritual weight. A consistent prayer life transforms your inner world before it transforms your outer world. Prayer regulates your emotions, disciplines your mind, and fortifies your spirit against the fluctuations of circumstance. Dominion begins within, in the unseen realm of thoughts, attitudes, and intention. When you pray consistently, you allow the Spirit of God to govern your inner climate, ensuring that peace reigns where chaos once ruled. The enemy loses access to influence your emotions because you operate from divine. Consistent prayer uproots fear, anxiety, and confusion, replacing them with boldness, clarity, and sound judgment. You become immovable, not because situations are easy, but because your spirit is anchored in continuous communion with God. Consistency in prayer builds spiritual infrastructure, the invisible framework that sustains visible. Many rise quickly but fall just as fast because they lack the spiritual foundation that only consistent prayer can build. Prayer is the scaffolding that supports destiny. It strengthens character, refines motives, and deepens roots so that fruit can remain. Dominion requires depth, and depth is developed through time spent in the secret place. Every consistent prayer session adds another layer of strength, another dimension of insight, another measure of authority. What consistency builds cannot be shaken because it is established in the eternal rather than the temporal. Prayer builds the inner architecture that can carry divine assignment without collapsing under pressure. When prayer becomes your lifestyle, you begin to live prophetic. Your responses are guided by revelation, your movements by discernment, and your words by divine inspiration. You don't react to the natural because you're anchored in the supernatural. Dominion is not reactionary, it's proactive. A praying lifestyle allows you to anticipate attacks before they manifest, to discern opportunities before others see them, and to shift atmospheres before crises emerge. Prayer trains you to rule by insight rather than hindsight. It positions you ahead of time because prayer invites you into the eternal perspective of God. You begin to operate from the finished work of Christ, declaring outcomes not based on probability, but on prophetic certainty. Consistent prayer also transforms relationships. It infuses divine love into human interactions, softening hearts and aligning intentions with heaven's agenda. A person of prayer carries peace that disarms conflict and wisdom that redirects confusion. Dominion is not domination, it is influence guided by love and truth. Through consistent prayer, you learn to lead with humility, to correct with compassion, and to serve with authority. Your life becomes a living intercession, a vessel through which others encounter God's presence without you having to announce it. This is the true mark of dominion, to govern with grace, to carry authority without arrogance, and to walk in power clothed in gentleness. A consistent prayer life also sustains divine momentum. Spiritual highs and lows disappear because consistency keeps the flame burning. Revival is not a moment of emotional intensity, but a sustained fire of devotion. Every prayer fuels the next, and the more you pray, the easier it becomes to remain in the flow. Prayer shifts from being an obligation to being oxygen for your spirit. Dominion flows from that continuity because there are no gaps for doubt or distraction to creep in. You remain spiritually alert, ready for divine instructions and responsive to sudden movements of the Spirit. Consistency keeps you spiritually charged, ensuring that your words carry the same power on ordinary days as they do in extraordinary moments. Through a consistent lifestyle of prayer, your perception of authority, you stop seeing dominion as an act of control and start seeing it as stewardship of God's will on earth. You become a co-governor with heaven, executing divine decrees through obedience and faith. Every prayer becomes a declaration of sovereignty, God's sovereignty through your yielded vessel. You no longer chase miracles, you carry them. You no longer seek breakthroughs, you manifest them. Because consistency has transformed your nature into alignment with God's dominion. The kingdom no longer visits you occasionally, it resides within you continually. Your very presence becomes prophetic, your words creative, your actions transformative. A consistent prayer life weaves divine order into every part of your being. Your time, priorities, and pursuits align with eternal. Prayer becomes the governing principle behind your decisions, anchoring your focus when distractions try to fragment your attention. Dominion requires discipline, and prayer cultivates that discipline until obedience becomes instant. You begin to live from the inside out, ruling your day before it begins, commanding your environment before it shapes. Each moment of consistent communion reinforces your authority to speak life where death lingers, to release peace where chaos reigns, and to establish victory where defeat once prevailed. When prayer becomes your constant state of being, your life becomes a sermon that preaches without words. People feel the weight of your connection with God, not through performance, but through presence. Consistency builds spiritual credibility, the kind that cannot be imitated because it is birthed through intimacy. Dominion ceases to be something you strive for and becomes who you are. You walk in quiet power, grounded in grace and guided by revelation. Every challenge becomes an opportunity to demonstrate God's rule through your response. You cease to live reactively and begin to live redemptively, turning opposition into opportunity and trials into testimonies, because consistency in prayer has made you one with divine intention.